Hi, Terry Hay here from Shock Treatment. Following up on our last video where we explained the benefits and the theories behind SAG, we're actually going to be setting up the SAG on a motocross bike here today. Now, when it comes to actually setting the SAG, there are three measurements that we want to concern ourselves with. The first measurement being that of free SAG, and that's with the bike unladen and fully extended. So we'll put the bike on a stand, let the rear wheel hang down as much as possible, and we'll take a measurement from the rear axle to a vertical point on the back of the bike. Next, what we'll do is we'll take the bike off the stand and we'll have our rider jump on board, and then we're going to measure what we call the rider, or some people call it the race SAG. Now, typically what we're shooting for is for that bike to settle with our rider on it, roughly 30 to 35% of the rear wheel travel. Given that a modern motocross bike has roughly 300 millimeters of rear wheel travel, we're typically going to be looking for 90 to 105 millimeters of rider SAG. Once we've set our SAG, what we're going to do is we're going to have the rider hop off the bike, and we're going to measure how far the bike compresses under its own weight. And so this is what we call our static SAG, and typically with the static SAG we're shooting for 10 to 15% of the rear wheel travel. Once again, if we do the sums on that, 30 to 45 millimeters. Now, what we'll typically find is with a lighter rider, they'll use a lighter spring, and it's the spring energy that's actually pushing up on the bike. So our static SAG with a lighter rider and lighter spring in it is typically going to be a little less than what we would get from a heavier guy. You know, with a heavier guy, we're going to put a heavier spring in the bike, and so it's logical that we're going to end up with a little less static SAG with a heavier rider. We're probably shooting more for around that 30, 32 millimeter mark. With a lighter guy, you can expect it to get out 40, 45 millimeters. Okay, it's not logical to expect that everyone's going to have the same static SAG measurement. Okay, now, if we don't fall within the zone, I mean, obviously we're going to adjust the spring pressure to make sure we've got our arbitrary 100 mil or 105 millimeters. Okay, but once that guy hops off the bike, our static SAG serves as an indicator to tell us whether we've got the correct spring or not. And so if we don't have 30 to 45 millimeters, let's say the guy's a little heavy and we've had to really crank down on that spring, and so we've put a lot of preload on it. Once he gets off that bike, the preload is obviously stored energy, and once he hops off, the back of the bike will get jacked up. And so we may end up with a heavy guy on a light spring. We might end up with only 20, 25 millimeters of static SAG, maybe even less. Okay, and so typically if we have less than our 10%, we need to put a heavier spring in there. We've put too much energy into that spring in order to achieve our SAG, and so with too much preload, our bike's going to be harsh and it's going to be skating. So we would need to put a heavier spring in. If we look at the opposite end of the scale, if we've had a heavy spring in that bike and we've had a lighter rider hop on, in order to get our SAG right, we're going to back all that spring preload off. And basically what's going to happen is when he hops off the bike, there's no energy to push the back of the bike up. And so we may end up with 55, 60 mil, anything like that. And so typically that bike's going to be a little lazy, it won't track the ground, we won't get the grip or the control that we're chasing. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to go to a lighter spring, put a little bit more preload to get him into that tuning zone. Okay, so let's get our rider and see what we end up with. So first measurement is our free SAG, and that's just measured from the back of the bike, from the rear axle rather, to a vertical position on the back of the bike. This works out pretty conveniently at 600 millimeters, and I've made a mark on the ruler that lets me know exactly where we're at. Okay, so we'll now take the bike off the stand, and I'll have Jaden on the bike as Grant holds the bike for us. Now what I want is, I always enjoy having the rider standing in the correct riding position. There are many takes on this. Some guys have them standing up on the pegs. Other guys might have them sitting down, but basically what I'd prefer to do is have the rider where he's going to spend most of his time. Now, a competent motocross rider is going to be standing up for most of the time around the track. Obviously he'll sit down in the corners, but predominantly standing. I don't agree with someone just standing upright on the pegs. Obviously, we want to make this as close as possible to our riding situation, and no one rides with their arm beside them standing bolt upright on a bike. So we'll take our measurement again. Now in this particular case we're showing 104 millimeters of sag. It's my measurement now is 496, but doing the maths here, basically we've got 104. Now what I'll do is just push down and let this come up very, very slowly. Take a measurement. In this case it's 106. Now we'll lift up and let it come down very, very slowly. And in this case we're 103. So that 3 millimeters difference is basically the drag that's in our pivot point. So we've got our swing arm bearings, we have the 2 shock mounts, we have the linkage bearings, all creating a little bit of drag, and so we account for that in our measurements. Just hop off, Jody. So just going to go back on the stand, guys. Oh, before we do. So 102, 106. Now what we're going to do is we're going to measure our static sag. That's with the bike under its own weight. Now we've got 38 millimeters. Push it down, we're now at 40. And we're at 37. That's one. Okay, so including our drag, we had 103 to 106, just accounting for the drag. If we basically halve that, that'll give us our rider sag. So we've got 104.5 millimeters of rider sag, and we'll have 38.5 millimeters of static sag. So the spring that we've got in here looks like it's going to be pretty much ideal for Jaden. Okay, so what we're going to do now, rather than just send him on his way, we're actually going to go and check and make sure that's right. So a lot of people will say that's it, his sag is set, away he goes, but we still don't know if that's going to be the optimum for him. So we're going to get out on the track now, and we're going to do a few laps, and we're going to try different measurements and see how we go. But where we are now, we're in the perfect starting place. Okay, now we're down on the track. We've got our rider out there. He's warming up himself and he's warming up the bike. Very important thing to understand is that the sag will also be affected by heat. So we have the heat of the gas reservoir and we have heat going into the spring, and they will all affect our measurements. So we'll get a couple of good laps put in, and then we're going to stop and we're going to make some adjustments. How'd you go? Good. Okay, let's hop off for a minute. Okay, there you go. Really don't want to tell our rider too much, just simply make a change and let him go out and determine whether it got better or whether it got worse. Okay, we'll see how we go. Okay, how was that?
That was heaps better. Just over small braking bumps, accelerating bumps. Just felt like it held that rear end up a lot more. Just stopped it from sitting down, and before it felt like it'd just sit down a little bit too much and then it'd kick you. So yeah, it just felt like it held that rear end up a lot more. You could get on the power easier and more controlled in the turns.
Okay, just hop off for a minute and just look away for a minute. We tell our rider to look away. We don't actually want him to see what changes we're making. If he knows what changes we're making, chances are he's going to be influenced by that. If we make it harder or if we make it softer, if we make it harder, you'll say it got harder. If we make it softer, you'll say it got softer. This way, he's unsure of what we're doing, and we'll get accurate information back from him because it won't be influenced. Okay. Okay, so after his initial warm-up, we made the suspension firmer and we had a major improvement. So now we've made it firmer again and hopefully it'll get better again. If not, we'll come back to where we were. But this is where everything comes into play, and this is when we get the correct sag setting.
That didn't feel like anything was good.
No, backwards step.
Yep. Definitely.
Okay, so we went backwards there, or not so much backwards, we've gone too far, and now we need to peg that back a little. So we had a big improvement on the first change that we made, and now with the second one, we've actually gone beyond what is a good setting. So now we're going to split the difference, see if we can hone that in and get an ideal setup for him. So hop off, look away. Okay. Well, we could even see the changes with that last setting that we had. Basically, you could see it was a little harsh, it was a little skittish. We've now got what was obviously too much preload on there, and the bike didn't hook up the way we'd like it. It looked a lot busier on the track. So now we've split the difference between the two. We'll see what he says after this lap. Okay, so we've now gone back to the setting that he first said he really liked, and he was quite happy with that setting, but now we just want to make sure that he's completely happy with what he's got. So this chance to go back to back is going to give us the best result. So we'll see how we go.
Definitely the spot right there.
That's it?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
That's everything you wanted to. Handles, bumps good. Best grip. I've got all of 3 or 4 sags tested, so very happy.
Beautiful. Okay. Go back to the workshop. Head on back and we'll see you up there. Okay, so that turned out to be the best setting, and we've confirmed it again with another lap. So he's very, very happy, and nice to have a test track in your backyard. Unfortunately, at the moment, you guys aren't seeing it in its best shape. We've had drought-breaking rain, and so we've got grass growing up everywhere, and a little hard to follow the bike on the track, but still good for testing. And as you can see up here, Jaden's driving back to the workshop, and makes it real easy when the rider can come straight off the track, straight back to the shop. We can make changes and come back and verify them. Okay, so we've done our track testing and we got a really worthwhile result. I mean, the bike was working okay as it was, you know, we had set our sag and everything, but a few little tweaks and all of a sudden we got a great gain. So that gives you a happier rider and you're getting the most out of your machine. So don't just stop with setting a sag, you know, go down the track, dial it in, doesn't take long, and it completes a picture for you. Now a couple of things that will affect your sag. Okay, the influences that we have. Okay, heat. Now heat will affect the gas in the reservoir, and that gas pressure will rise and that will actually mess with our sag. And also the spring's affected by heat. So as the spring gets warmer and warmer, we actually find its rate reduces. So these are things just to bear in mind. And one of the things that we wanted to do down there was we actually had Jaden do a few laps, get the bike warm, get himself warm, and then we could make our changes and get the most accurate result. With the gearing, if you go and change the sprocket on your bike, what's going to happen is you will move the axle and the swing arm. And when you do that, you've got to bear in mind that the swing arm is actually a lever, and that lever is working on the shock. So as you move your wheelbase, naturally we're going to change the rate of compression on the shock. So if we move it in, our shock will appear to get firmer. As we bring it back out, our lever gets longer and it's easier to move the load, so our shock will appear to get softer. And that will mess with our sag figure. So every time you make a gearing change, check your sag afterwards. Now another thing with your chain, as your chain stretches, what you'll find is that you're bringing that axle further back in the swing arm again. So once again, your leverage will change. So every 1, 2, 3 chain adjustments, just get back on the bike, check your sag again. Now, rider weight, not necessarily an adult rider, but adult riders can change weight. I've put on a little myself recently, but with kids, if we've got kids on their bikes, basically what's going to happen is they're going to get taller, they're going to get heavier. And so as they grow, basically just keep a check on their sag and adjust it regularly, and you'll keep them at optimum rate. Anyway, thank you very much.